Go ahead. Heather? We're back in,
Michael jumped from that
we're
one.
back in session now.
Are we on?
Yes.
Paul?
Paul's all ready.
Okay, cool. All right, so we are now back, and we are on the fire chief, or the fire department's budget. Fire chief's the first thing I see on here, so that's why I'm reading below the lines. There's nothing in red, so nothing actually increased at this point, other than salary line for the fire chief went up to 2%, as we have done for everybody else. Fire department wages and EMT wages. So what we did with this, we had this conversation a few times over the past couple of years, and we resumed this conversation this year. A lot of us felt that we needed to accurately reflect what work was being done in the fire department, because we have a fire service and also an ambulance service, but we keep asking the populace to, support the ambulance service and going to a second shift, but we really need to start building, what amount of money we're really spending from either of these operations. So what we ended up doing at the end of the day was we took the fire department wages and the EMT wages, we stuck them in a pot of money, and then we had requested from the chief to give us a proportional breakdown of what percentage of time folks are doing ambulance calls or ambulance calls are coming in, and what percentage of time there's fire calls coming in. We originally started with the number 8515, and we have revised it at his request to 7030. So that's what you see here, 70% is in EMT wages, 30% is in the fire department wages. The purpose of doing this is that if you assume that the majority of our calls, which they are ambulance calls, that means when you have the fire station staffed over there for the first shift, you will be pulling from the EMT wages side, whether they go out on a call or not. If they go out on a fire call, then you shift it to the fire department wages. If they go out at night on a fire call, you pull from fire department wages. It's all proportionate, because the idea at the end of the day, what we're trying to do in all the departments is build our statistics, build our data, because the people want to see where are we spending money from, what's it actually costing, and what's the most transparency we can do with these numbers in these different categories. Other things you see here, let's see, down at the bottom, ambulance, EMS expenses of $40,000. I imagine we probably reduced that slightly. We could go in more detail on that one, but essentially we looked at numbers that were spent this year and what was requested for things and moved forward with the number. A couple of things to note. When we started this conversation earlier, we talked about the ambulance receipts reserved for appropriation, and we said that that number at no time can exceed the amount of ambulance expenses on this line. You will see that ambulance, EMT wages is $174,000 in and of itself. At the EMT standby, which is another $35,000, which puts us over $200,000. Ambulance-related expenses, and then the EMT license certification puts us at $242,000. So that $177,000 does not come close to the $242,000, even if we use the whole thing, even if we use the new revised number of $192,000. On the revenue side, we are still spending more on this line, or in this department, than we are actually pulling in from the ambulance receipts reserved piece, which was a prior concern.
Okay, so the two issues here are, if we get the override, that the money, the 135 goes back in. If we don't, we're still roughly $35,000 short based on...
So what we did with the wages, when we were calculating what the number should be at, we looked at the current budget for FY16 and where we were. One of the lines was about $20,000 that we'd still have by the end of the year. The other one was about $10,000. The other thing to keep in mind is we were promised when all of the PCFs were filled out that these were temporary pay increases until June 30th. So those increases should theoretically go away. Even still, we did leave some wiggle room in those numbers for this piece, but this does not fund second shift ambulance service. We did not have another $135K to throw in. So if Prop 2.5 doesn't pass, it is not funded for in this piece. And it would probably equal the reduction of 2 to 3 departments in their entirety to do so without the Prop 2.5.
Yeah, I guess my concern, police and fire are too critical and highway behind it. And the more I learned about that 4, 5, 6 minutes extra response time to get there, I think is getting me more and more to believe that we need to provide some kind of second shift coverage, be it pieced together like we're doing now or with a full second shift.
John Workman, Fire Chief.
Yeah, just if I may, I mean, certainly strikingly, there's no red on this at all. All the other previous budgets have had increases in different spots. We talked about equitability, and the only one that had gotten a 2% increase was my salary. None of my firefighters received any 2%, 4%, 6%. They got nothing. By many of the black numbers you see up there, there's reduction, quite a bit on the fire department. I guess my concern is, police does a great job. They're a $600,000 budget. No one's expecting them to pay for themselves through the tickets that they write. We're receiving the highest quality ambulance service that the town can get with a paramedic level service. It's being offset by what we're getting in revenue to some degree. It's ultimately not costing that much for the taxpayer because of that offset, but it is costing something, as you said, 242, 176. So there's a cost there associated, maybe $70,000 for a paramedic level ambulance. I just feel that my members deserve a 2% raise. I may not go on a retro 2% raise just because we've always tried to stay with what the town is doing. They've been working along. I think that I would like to give them that 2%. We're the only budget, the only working here in town that didn't receive that 2%. I just feel firefighters who come out at 3 in the morning for whether it's a fire or an EMS call deserve that 2% raise, and that's why I put in for it. It's a little disappointing not to see it funded. I see increases in the expense budget for other folks, and I have an expense budget that doesn't include any equipment maintenance. I have no line item for equipment maintenance. I've got a lot of equipment, fire trucks and equipment, and there's no line item for fire department equipment maintenance. There's no line item for building expense. The $27,000 that the police have is great. It all comes out of EMS fire expense for the fire station. I just think the expectation for the ambulance receipts to pay for the whole fire and ambulance department is an unrealistic expectation. I feel like the dedication of the folks that work for this town, 40 members that provide service for 6,000 people, 24 hours a day, Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, for no overtime, no vacation, and no sick time. We have one full-time person, that's myself. They do a tremendous job. And I just feel, I'd ask for $5,000 in expense additional for some equipment maintenance. It seems to be taken out. I don't understand that. At some point, our equipment is going to fail. Do we just not repair it? Do we just always have to go to get new equipment once it breaks? It just feels like we're putting our firefighters at risk. It feels like we're putting residents at risk. I feel like I've come in front of the town and asked for gear, which is by NFPA mandate supposed to be replaced every 10 years. I've put on a budget cycle, which I've had to ask for outside of line item on a $9,000 a year to be spent on that so it doesn't hit us all at one time, trying to keep our firefighters safe. Honestly, I think that $9,000 should be a line item to have to go for it as an extra expense. I don't get an extra car. I don't get, to only get equipment for my guys. I'm always going to defer to that because I'm not going to ask my firefighters to put themselves into a dangerous environment without the proper equipment. So I guess I feel the budget is really cut back on the fire department in general, and that is concerning to me. The second shift is a difficult nut to crack. I think everyone knows it's unfortunate that the agreement with the state that was signed to bring the fire service up to paramedic standing, it's unfortunate that we didn't do the studies that were just done when that was put into place. It's unfortunate that it was signed by selectmen, signed with the state, with no funding for it whatsoever. My budget has been level funded, and it's challenging to provide the service that we've committed to with the state level funded. As a stopgap measure, because we had degraded service for a short period of time, I had money in my expense so that I could offer a double standby, because the state had given us a violation, said that the hours that the fire department always had and the agreement that we signed, we weren't compliant. So by doubling my standby, I allowed for these men and women this is their second, third, and fourth job for some of these folks. I gave them a little bit extra money for being in uniform, listening to their radio for 16 hours in a day. They get $100 for that. It's challenging also in that, I hear Finance Committee and they say, well, we want to see, it be taken out for, if they go to a fire, if they go to an EMS call. We know that on the average, as we go back through and we count up all the calls and where we've gone, that it's about a 70-30 split for EMS and fire. The trouble is that it's easy enough to bill a call out. If it's an EMS call, bill it out to EMS. If it's a fire call, bill it out to fire. What's difficult is the time that we spend in training that's cross-training, both EMS and fire. What's difficult is the time that they're in the station waiting for a call to come in, and where do you bill that out at? If we go out in a call and we do a car accident where you have a fire engine and an EMS call, am I splitting that bill? It just feels as though the accounting to see where that money's spent is a difficult accounting task. Not that we can't set rules and parameters so that if they go out on 2 calls that day or 3 calls, that we say 2/3 of it is whichever one that was and 1/3 of it is for something else. But to bill it out by the actual call wouldn't make sense, because it doesn't cover the extra hours where they were waiting for a call to come in. I just think my firefighters, EMTs, are cross-trained for the most part. We really want to make sure that the folks that are sitting in that station can respond to a fire and have enough knowledge and experience and certifications so that when they go into that fire, they can truly do a good job, save lives, save houses, and protect themselves. On the EMS side, we have, there's a huge requirement for how much, I'm sorry, I'm kind of going back and forth here a little bit, and I apologize. There's a lot of cross-training. I think that my guys are cross-trained in both fire and EMS. I think that at the end of the year, when we divide it out and say it's 70%, we can project budgets into the future to try and set up an accounting system that takes it on a day-to-day basis from where it goes is an extreme challenge, just bookwork challenge. And I don't know if it's necessary, if historically over the last 4 years we've spent 70% on EMS and 30% on fire. I think those are good numbers to work with. If we take past historic numbers that we use at $180,000 and $78,000 that it was funded for fire department wages, or $76,000, whatever, it works out to about that 70-30 split right there. I think that the firefighters, EMS, EMTs in this town, they deserve that 2% raise, and I think it should be reflected in that budget. I think that the town as a whole needs to step outside and understand that there's a lot of equipment over there that either we add a line item for equipment maintenance similar to what PD does, but we need to look at it and to keep cutting expenses, to have no red on the fire department cut sheet. It just makes providing service more dangerous for the firefighters, the 40 individuals that provide this service to the town, and eventually something's going to give, and we're talking public safety. I don't like the look of that.
Yeah. Would you like to say anything? A question on the 2%. Is it because they're not full-time employees that the fire department didn't get it?
I can speak to that.
Okay.
So in regards to the 2% and some of the other budget line items that were level funded, As Heather went over before, this was a zero-based budget, so present a budget in what you would, what you're requesting, what would you like? I'm honestly not aware that you put in the 2% for everyone. I don't know if that was communicated to us in the meeting, that a 2% was put in. I don't know if a directive was given to us.
Yeah, I'd actually sent the Finance Committee numbers that reflected that.
Okay. But I guess my question is, were we told that they would be getting the 2%, and
So,
was it in the information, right?
At the
Because
meeting that we had, I did give you information that showed that, and so I thought that was...
so the answer to this question is a couple-fold. Number one, first of all, remember that these are the positions last year that were getting, the amounts of pay did not stay the same from the beginning of FY16 to the end. Various people, like almost everyone, had increases in pay for this or for that, whether it was for EMT standby, hourly rate, what have you. They were all over the place. When we sat down for this, we did increase by 2%. The reason the numbers are lower, as I said earlier, was when we calculated out by the current rate, meaning the already increased rate that was already promised, we went out to the end of the year, we had about $30,000 left. That $30,000 left more than absorbed that 2% increase. We increased the 2%. Does this mean there's going to be everything smooth sailing over there and no cuts? No. Maybe we can't do a third rider. Maybe we have to look at other staffing, but for the most part, with the current rates and the information we have and the statistics, those numbers should get us to where we need to be. As far as the concern about budgeting or planning or invoicing out the two different department lines, other departments have been doing this for years. The police department, you have someone go here, go there, they have to make sure they account it to the right number. More specifically or harder has always been the highway department. You might have to build the water department, now you have to build the cemetery commission, don't forget the park commission. How many hours were you mowing?
I don't think that's an issue. I mean,
But-
we don't want to
So,
debate on that
as far
one.
as the building piece goes, we're more than happy to pull out a line saying building expenses. This will be the last building, I believe, that we have not extracted it from. And it's simply because, John, we've been trying to do things over time and make transitions easier. But if everyone wants to pull out the building expenses, I think we'd be more than happy to pull out the building expenses. It makes accounting different. It doesn't mean we add more money into the budget. It means we dive into the expense budget and we pull out the things that are building related into one line.
So you pay for that now out of the town-wide?
No. All of their budget pieces come out of that, just like previously Highway Department, they now have a building line. Before that, they all pulled out of the same expense line.
So if you pulled it out of
Part of the
department
problem is,
expenses.
like, if you look in, the furniture in the station is donated.
Yeah.
The rugs are threadbare. It doesn't make sense to me to afford to put in new rugs when I'm looking at equipment that's failing.
Yeah.
So, yes, we can try and pull it out of expense, but it's still, we haven't been spending the money to maintain it. Yes, do you have a question here that I could answer? And just if I may, it's easy to throw out that we pull off the third rider, but the third rider is a mandate by our medical control and affiliation agreement that the members that we put on the ambulances have adequate training. That adequate training requires them to have certain amount of ride time. To put a third rider in, we actually created a third rider position, which is a minimum wage position, so that young Southampton kids can, if they have a desire to come in to Southampton Fire Department and join up and become an EMT, that they can do a third rider with Southampton Fire Department and become a fully functional ambulance EMT. A lot of the young kids that were covering our nighttime schedule, when the town had initially gone to the advanced level service, they spent $5,000 of their own money to go to paramedic school. They're just now coming out of that 2 years later, and now I've got to set up a position where they're a probationary paramedic, because we didn't have that before. I can't pay them full paramedic, but they have to do ride time. They have to be checked out by medical control until they can become a full paramedic, and we can give them paramedic wages, which I sat with Personnel Policy and Procedure Board to determine what those paramedic wages would be. So I've worked my budget to keep everything within the budget to the best of my ability, and I think I've been creative in order to meet the state mandates and the state violations that have come this way, given the fact that the town entered into an agreement, which I'm now trying to make good on with the limited resources. I personally believe the second shift is a phenomenal service for the residents of Southampton. I think, Granby, which is the same size community, can afford advanced level service with full-time people. We're offering the advanced level service with folks in station 4 hours more a day than Granby offers for a budget that was $40,000 under what Granby had for a budget. We're not paying overtime. We're not paying, we're very cost conservative. And I think that that's something that doesn't get out. I think a lot of residents, as we've gone to talk to them recently, they don't realize that there's only one full-time firefighter there. So,
Yeah, I think it's a critical department, and we've got to make sure we have the proper funding. I guess one comment came up about the wages were all over the place last year, EMT standby, et cetera, et cetera. But we have protocol that if you get a certain degree, you get an extra dollar. If you achieve this level, you get to me, that's not wages all over the place. That's just people earning what they deserve.
yes.
So I don't want to use that in a negative sense.
Just to clarify, this was incentive pay for coming in at night and for...
Right, that was that short period, till June 30th, right.
Yeah.
But the other increases were based on protocol and them earning it. So I don't want to give the impression that we're just willy-nilly paying
No,
them.
it's absolutely not willy-nilly. We have not, like I say, we weren't even thinking about giving the 2% that all the other town had gotten in retro. We were thinking of only giving 2% moving forward. I think that what I've really tried to do, when I first came in, there was a $3 a day, $3 an hour incentive to work days. I have more guys that can work days. I don't need that $3 an hour incentive. It didn't make any sense to me, so I did away with it. I reallocated that money to when people do a Firefighter 1 Academy training that takes them 16 weeks to go through, and they get certification to national fire standards, they get $1.50 for that. If they become an EMT, a functioning EMT, independent EMT, they get there's money allocated for that. I have a whole breakdown sheet of how they get money based off of base pays. I think it's an incentive-driven pay scale. I think that one thing that I've also tried to do because of some past problems is I've decentralized. I think some of the problem that we had in the EMS services, we had one person responsible for everything in that EMS, and rather than having a single point failure, I've really made it so that the duties and responsibilities get dispersed through more than just one member, and I've given pay incentives rather than paying a deputy salary that's very high. I then do it across the board so that
So you've
it
been
gets taken care of.
creative. Yeah, I've always said for years, it amazes me with a $15 million budget or whatever, we can't have a proper fire and police and highway department. Critical places. So we got to see what the votes bring, obviously.
Absolutely, yeah,
Thanks for going over that.
sure.
Any other comments?
I just have a couple for the group, if that's okay. So I do want to hit up request versus recommended on the budget, because I feel like that's kind of been glossed over a little bit. So the original request for fire chief's salary matches what was recommended. The original request for fire department wages included the second shift, so that was taken out.
When you say second shift, it's a difference of $25,000, it looks like here.
Correct. So
That wasn't a full second shift.
So I'll preface with the second shift wages were taken out, but due to the balancing 70-30, the numbers don't necessarily match up. If you were to get the sum of both, you would see the difference there.
So just ask a question to the fire chief. Did you include that 135 in the original request?
Yeah, and what was there it was broken out a bit, because what happens is, currently, the way that we allocate wages are daytime shift gets paid out of EMS expense
Okay.
account, nighttime shift gets paid out of fire expense account.
So it was in there, but just allocated?
It was allocated different, all the training was on the fire expense side, and
Okay.
so some of it was allocated on that part, and then some of it was in direct EMS wages.
Okay, thanks.
So the next item, fire department expenses, was 40,000 requested. We recommended 35, which was level funded from FY16.
A question on that, because it's not broken out. So does this 35,000 include maintenance of the building? Does it include utilities for that building?
Yes.
So really, expenses that go directly to the fire department for equipment and all that are substantially less than this. That'd be nice if we could break it out at some point so we know.
Definitely. Next line item, EMT standby, requested 35,100, recommended 35,100. EMT wages, similar to fire department wages, it included the second shift. We took that out, did the shuffle. Like Heather mentioned, with the two wages, we looked at what was actually used, and we took out some float that was in there, right, some extra funds. Still leaving funds to operate the department for the year. Next item, ambulance billing, requested 7,000, recommended 7,000. EMT licensing and certification, requested 2,500, recommended 2,500. Ambulance EMS expenses, requested 40,000, recommended 40,000. Now, the difference between FY16 BAM versus FY17 recommended is the ambulance monitor, because we had made a transfer in there. So that's why when you look at BAM, you'll see 75,989. Correct? So that included a one-time transfer to cover the cost of that monitor. So it isn't a reduction, without knowing the actual FY16 original, but it's level funded, right? It's based off of the requested. I think there are some other things to just to keep in mind too. I mean, we talk about the maintenance of equipment, but let's live in the moment, right? We just had a consultant report done that recommended we have too much equipment.
We have a fire truck.
Right. Do we maintain the fire truck, right? That's added things to maintain. We have another building. Do we use the building? Do we just store in the building? I understand we're looking at this right now, but let's also consider what was just done, what we just used grant funding to do, to look at that. Same thing with wage classifications for organizational, charts and decisions and those types of things. So I feel as a group, we did well. We operated within the zero-based because we gave him the majority of the requests he had. The ones we didn't were wage-related because we do have a public vote to decide on the second shift. To be frank, like Heather said, we don't have the ability to draw funds to fund that second shift without decimating a department, which means people's jobs. And I understand we talk about the importance of, life in the minutes, and I understand that, but we're also dealing with other people's livelihoods here. I mean, if we want to take a stance and fully fund everything, we need to be prepared for the other side of that coin of jobs, people's livelihoods, of departments, which are already strapped to begin with. And everyone appreciates the ability to be creative. I mean, we're going to meet with the assessors Monday to talk about how to help them out. Didn't even get his attention, but we appreciate that, but splitting things up is also helpful. Fire department versus EMT. I mean, we have, there's a large salary range there, and we've talked about this before. Sometimes we send an EMT to a fire call. Does he charge an EMT rate? Does he charge a firefighter rate? All those things, if you split things out by call, they become visible. They become transparent in the future, those types of things. So,
Can I speak to some of that?
Sure.
Actually, it's up to the chair.
Yeah, no, I know it's taking a little time, but I like to hear it because I think it's
certainly
important.
apologize. And I understand the work that finance has done, looking at the numbers. And it is challenging across the board because there's no money in town for funding for anything. The challenges that I faced in making up a budget was, one, that we've had a change because we downgraded service for a short period of time and then upgraded, so any historic numbers for this past year weren't going to be reflective of what we would have if we hadn't downgraded at all. So that was one challenge because historic numbers are not going to be spot on accurate. I think when we talk about the second shift, part of the problem is, before I came, is this agreement that we've signed into with the state, and I recognize that if a second shift doesn't get funded, even though I put it into the budget, the problem is, what do? I did a stopgap measure with the money that I had in my budget to fund through the EMT standby. That account only had $35,000. I'm overspending that account now. If we're not going to fund a second shift, I believe we really need to almost double that EMT standby, which is a minimal increase into the budget for $35,000. I think that we're getting by doing that. I don't think that we're doing anything astronomical. We're not quite meeting what the state wants, but if the town doesn't have money, then that's a minimal way to kind of get by. I don't know how to reflect that, and I imagine that's a challenge for the Finance Committee to look at that also, because if it gets funded on a town meeting, on the ballot question, then there wouldn't even be the discussion. We wouldn't need to increase the EMT standby. The problem is if it doesn't pass on that, then we really will need to look at that EMT standby, and how do we do that? Do we do that now at the budget meeting tonight, or do we try and do that somehow a different way later? And I don't have good answers, and I do appreciate the work that they did to put the budget together. I understand that, and just to be clear, EMTs, we have firefighter EMTs, there's many different varieties to put it together. Our focus is really to get people, the ambulance out the door, but we're trying to cross-train everyone. So no one gets paid a different wage. They get paid a wage for the jobs that they can perform. So if they're a firefighter EMT, they'll do firefighting, they'll do EMT, they get paid as a firefighter EMT. If they're just an EMT, they don't go to a fire call. So there's no billing for them for not going, because they don't go to a fire call unless they're working an ambulance as support service, because firefighters need an ambulance when they go to a structure fire. If they're a paramedic, I only have one paramedic that's not a firefighter complete. She used to run a helicopter service. She's an excellent paramedic. So I make an allowance, because to have that quality of personnel on the department, even though they can only work as a paramedic, I can back them up with a more inexpensive firefighter to get the firefighting service if we need it, and send a fire engine out the door.
Okay. And I guess a comment on the equipment. I agree, the study said we have too much equipment. I think they're talking about fire stations and fire trucks.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
if you need to buy new SCBA equipment or new hoses, that's a whole different ballgame. If you don't have them, you're putting people in jeopardy,
Yeah.
so.
So do we not have a mechanism in place to buy turnout gear or those types of items?
There's no mechanism in
No
place.
mechanism.
I've come in front of the,
Capital improvement.
They said put it in the budget a couple of years ago, didn't they?
yeah,
On
they
that?
did, because
The
it's,
turnout?
I basically, a capital, well, they didn't actually say what, to put it in the budget, but I've been going for a capital improvement, $9,000 every year, which we need to do every year in order to be compliant.
And I sit on the capital committee, and every year, you've been given $9,000. It's recommended this year again
Yep.
for turnout gear.
Yeah, the problem is, though, is just all the equipment. I mean, brush trucks, I mean, if we look at the report that was done, he says concentrate on a tanker and a brush truck.
I understand that,
Get
and
rid of
capital reviews all those, and the fire department scored against other town departments.
But,
I'm less
Okay.
concerned about the capital, is the
Okay.
day-to-day operations, keeping the equipment and the men safe and women safe.
yeah,
I will say that I would like to see that he breaks out not only the fire station here, but the Bleemer Road station separately.
Yep.
So we get a report next year that shows what our expenses are from that other station. Because that other station is just sitting there as a mothballed station.
No, I agree 100%. That way we
and
know.
it's challenging because it has a tanker in it, so it's heated, because there's water in the vehicles that are there.
And the report says that we should have 2 fire trucks responding, not 3, which would open up a bay for a tanker here. There's a lot of discussion that's got to take place on
Sure.
that, and it's not here for this budget meeting tonight, but there's a lot of discussions that are going to happen in the next 6 to 8 months on this.
Yeah, absolutely, because changing the equipment takes costs also.
I know,
So let's save the discussion, I guess, right?
yeah.
Do you have one?
Yeah, I'm just curious about the 2%
Sure.
wage increase for the firefighters.
Yeah. Did that get fully answered?
Yes, and it's included in there, but it didn't need to be increased to cover it
Okay,
based on.
so it was built in, it just was kind of misunderstood how it was built in, but it's in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good, so it's in there. So we're
Well,
gonna,
and they say it's in there, but I look at, okay. It's just challenging to see it, and what's also difficult is we don't know how many calls we're going to go on.
yeah, that's just the type of service it is,
It's
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, if you look at
Thanks.
the EMT wages, we're only at, 60% to date,
Right,
and so.
we're already
there's a
through,
lot of wages in there.
okay. Yeah, again, it's one of these services that we
Yeah.
hope you don't spend all your money because we don't need it.
I just want it to be
Okay.
fair,
That-
you know.
yeah.
for all.
Yeah, and just to say, one thing that's been really good about as I allocated money for the standby shift, the extra standby shift, we're doing, to date, just from January 1, we've done an additional almost 50 calls over what we'd done last year.
Yeah.
The good part of that is that we get additional revenue from that. The bad part is that it's going to hit into my budget for wages,
Yeah.
because if we're doing 50 additional calls, that means we're paying individuals to be on
I think you
those
can come
calls.
back later down in the year and verify that, and we can look at that then.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot.
I know the finance committee would love to see something in relation to that.
Yeah.
With the incentive pay, I think we originally discussed it when we went over those PCFs, was at the end of the day,
I'm catching hell for not being in front of a mic, Mike. You might as well, too.
When the PCFs were in front of us in regards to the incentive pay, we had discussed, and it would be great to see what has the effect of that been, because we had talked about missed calls and how many calls we could get, and it's always been there's always questions about how many calls are there, do we miss calls, how many are aided from another area, and just at the end of the day, having a report would be great to see that, to see the effect.
I think we all agree more statistics and breakdown is what we're going to be looking for in the
I
future.
recommend we move
Okay,
to the next topic.
sounds good. I don't think we need a motion. Why don't you go ahead, Heather?
I just want to go back really quick to the police chiefs for 10 seconds. The police chief just brought something. He just wanted to mention what he had in his original proposal as to the funds he has now, based on a question John had asked earlier.
Okay.
Just quickly, just because 663,000 versus 610, I figured I'll give a little more explanation. When I met with the Finance Committee, I talked about, wanting more money for training, which I touched on. However, also, I had talked about putting the midnight sergeant back on. We haven't had a midnight sergeant for a year or so, which I feel would be important. We're paying senior officers to be officers in charge. We're paying them for that position. If I had a sergeant, we'd be paying the sergeant's position. We'd also have a supervisor on most of the shifts on their 4 and 2 schedule. It would also alleviate overtime when a supervisor needs to be called in, because the supervisor would be working. I also wanted to put on a detective sergeant position for all investigations. Our overtime is eaten up quite a bit by officers coming in on overtime for investigations. This position would cut down on the overtime position. Funding for that, there's no longer a Step 5 lieutenant, there's no longer a Step 5 sergeant. They're both at Step 1s, the 4 to 12 sergeant and the lieutenant. So money's been saved there. Money's been saved for not paying a midnight sergeant for a year. So I want to try to do that within the budget that was given me, but I would like to meet with the Finance Committee again to discuss that a bit more. And also, I was advised to put in for another full-time officer to replace one that we haven't replaced yet.
Is that included in the 610?
No, that wouldn't be covered.
So that's another $40,000, $50,000.
Correct. So to get us back to almost where that 663 was, so I just wanted to give you a little more insight what I was looking to do.
Okay.
But I'd like further time to discuss it with the Finance Committee.
Can I ask who recommended the extra person?
When I was at the Finance Committee, I was advised to put one on,
Okay.
or to put one in.
But there's none in there now.
Correct.
So we'd have to go back and adjust this budget and find that $50,000 somewhere else.
we approach the budgeting as a needs-based. So if you feel your department needs it to operate at a level of service, include it, and we can discuss it.
So just to summarize what Mike was saying, I think Mike was just going in to explain why his original requests were at the number. He
Yep.
can operate at this number, but
Yep.
his additional requests, the nighttime sergeant, the detective position, they may not be able to be accommodated within these numbers, but he's going to work with the best he can. There might be a little more ability for him to build forward, given the fact that people are at lower rates now than they were previously due to new positions.
I think
Does
we
that?
So,
does
yes,
that-
so I'll work the numbers and see where I'm at, but in order to get those positions, it might be a little above that 610, definitely with another full-time officer.
I think I got that, no translation needed.
Okay.
But a question for you.
Yes.
The midnight to 8, you have somebody who's a take-charge person, a person in charge.
officer in
So you have to
charge.
pay him a stipend.
Yes.
Is that stipend much different than if you had a sergeant there?
There's a difference.
But I mean, is it a
but
big
it's-
difference
But it's
where,
not a huge difference.
so maybe
No.
putting a sergeant in there wouldn't be that much of a leap in your budget?
That's the thing, it isn't going to cost that much to pay the difference for those two
That may
sergeant
be a
positions.
step to follow up on.
Right,
Yeah.
perfect. And it would, like I said, save on the overtime.
Sure.
And with that extra officer, it would save on overtime because we also are filling those shifts with part-timers as much as we can, but it also sometimes goes to overtime.
Sounds like the return on investment is there. Talk to the finance committee on
I
that
will.
one. Okay, thanks.
Heather, Shepherd's Hook.
Shepherd's Hook. Gotcha. All right, so the next one here on public safety is the building department. So as you can see here on the numbers, you have two reds that went up. Gas and plumbing expenses, what that was we actually extracted that outside of the original inspection expenses. The concern is that Tom had asked to delineate them or separate them because he wanted to show that, there are expenses associated with this position that are outside of the normal building commissioner's expenses for books, educational materials, continuing ed, office supplies, and the like. There is no expenses that we're currently enduring for the electrical inspector, otherwise you would see that here. E-permitting software was something the board decided to enter into last year for half the year. This is the full cost annually of $4,000. That includes, I believe, 3 to 4 licenses. We currently have an iPad that's up and running. Part of the expenses down here actually includes the cost of what's called the jetpack, which is something you hook onto the iPad and you have internet on the road. So the building commissioner is now equipped to be able to be on the road, go out and inspect someone's house, pull it up on his iPad, see if there's been any other calls, violations, and also to do all the signing improvements, approvals, and everything right on site. We're hoping over the next year or so to start extending this and to get the same setup for the assessor's office. The service does extend to other departments, but it would allow, so if Mike goes out to assess a house, he can respond to things right on the scene for when he's doing like a certificate of occupancy piece. So he can do his sign-off right on the road, not while driving. The building inspector salary, it's 2% increase over last year. Any questions on this piece? Building inspector alternate, we keep it at $800. That covers when Tom's on vacation. Most of the time, he's pretty good at letting folks and builders know that he'll be away. So generally, I think this year to date, we haven't spent any of that because we haven't had to call anyone in. Of course, you do want a budget for this piece because you have things like the Helen Drive fire last year. Of course, Tom was away when it occurred, so. Thoughts, questions? Cool. All right, public safety total, FY 14, 15 actuals, budget as modified 16 and 17. We actually look like we've gone up almost $70,000 here, just under. Questions? Okay. Education, this is what John Fitzpatrick has subscribed for, signed up for, and waited patiently for 2 hours and 25 minutes to get to. So we have here a breakdown. You have FY 14's actuals, 15 actuals, budget is modified for 16, and 17 recommended. I do not show the requested numbers here. What we've been basing on for the past couple of years is net school spending. We're going to look at one thing first, and then we'll come up to the rest of the stuff. So down here, you see something called Hampshire Regional Operating. That's the expenses for the Hampshire Regional High School or middle school up in Westhampton. And that increased to $4,714,176. Folks always ask, did we meet net school spending? Yes. On that budget there, we exceeded it by $1.2 million. Why did we go up so high? Well, what happens is there's 5 districts that are involved. All the districts get votes at the school committee. School committee does what the school committee is supposed to do, and they advocate for the kids. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the school budget itself only increased by 2% and some change. However, they allocated and assess it to all the municipalities based on their percentage of enrollment. Town of Southampton has about 53% of kids enrolled in the school based on the formula they use over a period of years. Therefore, we get 53% of the cost. In this case, it was a little over 4% that we ended up increasing from the previous year. So you see that there. So it went up from 4.5 million to 4.7 million, which is very hefty for us there. Another thing to look at that doesn't really, isn't really a debatable issue is the Hampshire Regional Capital, and this is actually starting to decrease because over time you pay off your debt and the number goes down. So let's go back up top here. So we have one more let's talk about first, the vocational transportation line, which is 62,370, it went up $20. That is the line we're assessed of how much it costs to commute our children to the Smith Vocational School. We currently, as you may recall, do not pay to transport any kids who wish to go to Westfield. We generally allow them to go there, but they're on their own for transportation. Vocational tuition, local school, we'll jump to local school transportation, I guess, next, because that's the next easiest one to start playing with. So in FY16, we budgeted the number, or the costs, were $238,385,000. A couple things have happened since then. Number one, the contract goes into another year, and the base cost goes up by $10,000. So looking at the cost starting at FY16 to looking at FY17, the cost should really say $248,365 for the total cost of transportation. If you may recall that a few months ago, the school department had decided to cut a bus and therefore allowed savings on the side of the town. Those savings, we're still trying to determine the total number, but our best guess is about $20,000. When we had finalized this budget on Monday, we didn't have the calculations before us, so we went ahead and we budgeted half of, or what we could at least see foreseeably, which was at least a $10,000 savings, or $11,000 savings. That's why you see the FY17 number, actually, I think $1,000, give or take, less than FY16, because we took the total number, 248, and we subtracted 11,000. However, the total savings for that one bus that were cut is approximately another 10,000 down. That's why we talked about this previously. So if we were to reduce this 237 to 227, that would pretty much cover the bus being gone completely permanently as it is this year. Unfortunately, we've got correspondence from the school department that suggests that they'd like to keep the number at this plus $10,000, so make it at 248, to be able to put that one bus back because of complaints of overcrowding. I would suggest, my recommendation would be to lower this to the 227 and fund it out where we are with the school buses right now. The other change from last year to this year on the school buses is there are a lot of complaints, it's my understanding that it's not the school department's intent to continue charging a bus fee to non-school choice children. Therefore, that $25K that was coming in to offset that last bus is potentially $11,000, but we're not sure. So that's the transportation line as it is. That's where there's a little potential for wiggle room. Now you have the elementary school and the vocational tuition, and you will see those went up. Let's go to my next slide here. So looking at annual trends, you have the elementary school and the Hampshire Regional operating. So up at the very top is your Hampshire Regional is up here. And you see it steadily goes up, or a little more than steadily. This looks a little steeper. You have the Norris Elementary School, what we've been funding based on what we had, which goes down a little up and slightly more up. And then you go down to Smith Vocational School, which although the numbers are much lower to play with, you see that it goes right over to the right, very drastically. Why is that important? Well, let's look at net school spending for FY17. Of net school spending, remember it includes elementary school, charter, school choice, vocational tuition, and indirect costs. As of right now, our elementary school is only absorbing 68% of the funds that are meant to go into the elementary school. 18% of the funds are going to vocational tuition, 13% are going to indirect costs. That's actually down from the actual number we are more likely to hit. This year, we've only put in for $700,000 in indirect costs instead of what we've been putting, which is closer to $750,000. So we've reduced our indirect costs, and we've still only got 68% of this portion into the elementary school. Charter school tuition is very small. School choice tuition only accounts for 1% of our net school spending. So we have a breakdown here of the requests, net school spending, and the changes here. First, you have the elementary school. The principal's request, which was higher than the school committee's request, but we put in the higher numbers of all the requests we got, was $4.1 million. Net school spending requirement based on the numbers we need to meet this year, and this was based on the original $10,000 for charter school tuition that has recently gone up to 20 as the proposal in House Ways and Means, gives you the net school spending number for the elementary at 3.7, and ultimately at the end of the day, we're looking at closer to 3.8 of what we'd be able to fund them at. That reduces, like I said before, the indirect costs down below, go from 750 to 700. The number you see here that shifts is the vocational tuition. You may recall that a few weeks ago, or actually it feels like a month or so, Smith Vocational applied for a waiver to DESE to keep their tuition rate the higher number as opposed to being required by Massachusetts to reduce it to the lower number. The decision from DESE came back and the answer was kind of a split. Instead of allowing them to charge $556 per kid, they're only allowed to charge $17,000. So you see the number $1,047,000 reduced to $1,019,000 because the savings there, 52.5 kids, times the 556 went up here. So that's why that number went from 3.7 to 3.8. Now, the question that's going to be debatable at this point is when you're down with the vocational tuition, that's still covering 52.5 kids and then the Westfield students. We have 2 Westfield kids. So the 52.5 kids, that's $17 a head. We have yet to have a year where we've actually had everyone who signed up go to Smith Vocational. In past years, we've only had 42, 43 kids sign up, so we're looking at 10 kids more than ever before having had signed up, and the question is, what's the percentage that are actually going to go? If you recall, every year we try to move a little bit of this number at the beginning up to here so that Norris doesn't have such a hard time going through the year, and that way they don't get to the point where we have to lay someone off today, and by the way, we can hire them back tomorrow. But it's really about the balance. You want the right number. These numbers aren't going anywhere else in the budget, so this is just the balance within, provided the board still wishes to fund at net school spending. If we were to fund outside of net school spending, we would need more money in our budget, because this is nickel and diming here. So what we need to decide is how many students out of the 52.5 do we expect will not go, or do we want to gamble on, and multiply that by 17K and move it up to elementary school. John?
So this is a yearly version of dialing for dollars. And we didn't do this, last year we fully funded, and then you might remember at the annual we asked for an amendment on the floor that was supported, and we moved $40,000 from what you see in the vocational tuition, moved that up into the elementary school. And then at the January special, we moved another 30. So I believe that total is sitting at 70. I'd have a question of where we are. I know that we had, Heather, something from the commissioner that said that we were short 1 year, right? And then and some kind of penalty or what, I'm not sure what the numbers are. But I also believe that there are still numbers in vocational tuition that would need to be transferred. Is that correct? Over and above the 70 that's already there?
So to answer the last question first, I don't know. I don't know if Vicki has spoken with Bobby on the current numbers for this year's net school spending, and also I don't know if she's spoken to Bobby about any remaining funds come the end of the year for Smith Vocational. But if that was the case, as usual, we generally have to transfer it over if we're not at the point where we're going to meet net school spending numbers. FY15, we did not meet net school spending numbers because the indirect costs ended up, at the end of the day, coming out less than what we had anticipated. We weren't following them as closely as we probably should have, So this year, the balance that was left over for last year was added to this piece. However, we've done capital projects and the like, so most of that funds, we're at par, we're where we're supposed to be,
Okay.
give or take.
So,
I think Vicki has a add-on.
yeah, and I don't think we need to, my question was more about, is there more coming? And it sounds like not, maybe, or,
In talking to Bobby, her and I discussed the net school spending with the shortage of the $25,000 from 15, and that, from our preliminary discussions, has been covered. We cannot use the capital project for the $24,000 for the phone system at the school towards net school spending because it's not an extraordinary expenditure. I'm trying to think of the exact wording, but because it's not extraordinary in terms of the Department of Education, we can't use that towards net school spending. Now, we will have some money left in vocational tuition, because we only have one bill left to pay towards the end of the year, because they bill, I think, quarterly. They bill by the day. So it's like the first bill you get is 60 days times whatever the rate is, they split it up. And so I think Denise just sent us that last bill, so there will be money left, like $12,000 or $15,000 that we can transfer to the school in the next week or two.
and really in my mind, what I was trying to get at was, there was the 40, then the 30, aside from any penalty, because
It's only 45. We did 30 and then we did 15.
was it only 15
Yes,
special?
yeah. Because we weren't sure how much would be left at the end, I believe. I'll double check, because maybe I
Maybe
didn't.
it's different than what the warrant, 'cause I thought it was the warrant, but I could be-
Anyway,
I could be
I'll
wrong.
check it, I'll
Okay.
check it.
Long story, trying to get to the point of what do we move, right, from vocational tuition this year, so that we, A, don't go to annual saying, hey, we'd like to do something different than what it says in the paper, right, and ask for it says on the paperwork, and ask for an amendment. And to the point that was made earlier, how do we sort of pay ourselves now and figure it out later, when we get to knowing more about, we don't know how many kids are there until October and November. It doesn't come back from the state. That coincides with our first special town meeting, or prepares us for the second special town meeting. Because we're living so close to net school spending and finance, vocational tuition used to be the free cash generator, John, you remember, right? I mean, that was...
Long time.
Because we didn't live near net school spending, that was something that we budgeted at 100% for the kids that applied, and then it became free cash because we were never close enough to net school spending that it needed to go anyplace else. And if we need to make corrections, I think I'd much rather, and I'm confident that the committee does as well, would much rather make the adjustments towards the end of the year because we got burned on vocational tuition than have to make recorrections in the operating budget of Norris because we made adjustments today that we didn't need to make.
Quick question, going back to the numbers. Did you
Yep.
say we have projected 52?
52.5.
Okay. And historically, we always project more because people dropped out. Do we have on top of your head, the average people, the number of students that...
I don't have it top of my head, but I can tell you that there's a spreadsheet out there that says last 10 years, here's what it has been.
Okay.
And we felt very comfortable last year when we asked for the 40,
Yeah.
that it was half of what we thought half of what the savings was going to be, being very conservative.
Okay.
And if we're 40, and I thought 30, but we'll figure that out.
So if we want to
think
see
that
if we want to see the trend, we can just get the spreadsheet?
Yep, yep.
Okay.
Yep. I'd like very much to, not that this is an auction or anything, but it's sort of shells, right? I'd like to leave here with $100,000 moved from the million up to the elementary, and I think if somebody pushes the page up button twice, we'll see the trend for the last couple of years, and it might justify it. I don't know where is the, oh, it's this guy.
It's the backwards.
Oh, yeah, you got me. No, I guess it was 3 times, sorry.
Which one do you want?
That one.
So, can I jump in?
Sure.
So I just want to add that, we can take funds from Smith Vocational, or from the vocational tuition line, but once we give the funds to the elementary school, we can't take them back, So the key thing to note is we have to be really cautious on this one, because if we allocate too much from vocational to the elementary school, and then we're shy $30,000, $40,000 come October, come January, we're now finding $30,000, $40,000 from free cash, from operating expenses, reducing someone else's budget to come up with that number, because we can't just move it back. It's not that simple. At the same point, what I was mentioning earlier is each kid's about $17,000 for the cost. That's baseline without including, special education costs for a percentage of them. So you would just take, 2 kids would be $34,000, 4 kids would be $68,000. I don't know if Vicki has an opinion on where she would feel comfortable for a number, but I would almost say to the Board of Selectmen that if there's unless they feel they need more information on the spot and they just want to see the trend of this piece, this isn't one that operates outside of the budget within itself. So this may be something we can talk about next week on the warrant day, to simply allocate how much money in the vocational and how much money up there. It's not a separate article item, it's just part of the budget piece of the percentage split.
If it stays in the top and the vote doesn't need it, then you use it for whatever you need to use it for, and it sticks in the budget for next year, right?
Correct, because the recommended budget is 160,000 short of a level services request.
But
plus the ELL.
does this increase the budget next year because we moved it from the voc line up? It then becomes a base number, and we do it again next year and next year. I think that's what we had talked about in the past. Am I remembering that correct for Finance Committee? Yeah. So it's a way to increase the top line. I understand why, but we don't get it back if it's not.
And I don't disagree with finding the right number, right? And I'd be silly if I didn't ask for
Oh, yeah.
the
You're doing your job.
most aggressive number,
Yeah, you're doing your job, yeah.
Right? But where you're so close to net school spending, this is the net school spending budget, right? So it's money that's going to be spent.
Yeah.
It's about where do you put it to begin the year?
Yeah.
And it's finding that right number.
Because as it stands now, between what was, the budget is modified for the elementary school, and that includes those 2 other appropriations
Right.
at the special town meetings, we're only $45,000 more than that. And their salary 2% contractual increases plus the new sped teacher, the position they have to have, that's $190,000. So if you think about it, all those teachers aren't going to get raises. In order to give the teacher raises, you're going to have to cut something, and there's nothing else to cut, because pretty much the entire $210,000 budget increase from last year is all contractual 2% increases. So just kind of keep that in the back of your brain. It's not anything else extra. So,
It's just moving from vocational upward. It's just a,
right, but I'm just
budgeting
saying, if you don't do it at the beginning of the
over.
year, then you will have that potential of laying teachers off to pay the other teachers their 2% increase.
but if we move the $100,000 up, that becomes the base budget for next year. And no
Could
matter,
potentially be, yes.
and no matter what vocational is next year, we have to fund it. So then, if we move more up next year, it's almost like we were talking about with the base salary, increase in the base salary. Once it's in there, it's in there. I just want to be careful that we
Yeah,
don't.
I guess I just wanted to point out the fact that you're giving them an increase and you're meeting net school spending, but you're only giving them $45,000.
I mean,
and
we need to fund what we need to
It's
fund.
not a lot of
yeah.
money for the entire school, so just,
And I would agree with your argument, I guess, if we weren't towing the line on net school spending.
Yeah.
Right? And since we are, then it's just it's a matter of, in the room, we figure out which line we put it. What do we start with? I mean, because what we're talking about, what we're requesting here is what we're actually doing now, right? We did some of it at annual, we did some of it at special, and we're going to do some of it in the next 2 weeks, or...
No, we've got to meet our obligations, no doubt. I just wanted to clarify that.
So you'd mentioned you call it a figure of 100,000. Is that for, I mean, are you planning to continue a service, continue an employee, add a service? Like, where would that $100,000 go at the?
It would bring us $60,000 short of the level service request.
Okay.
Is that with or without funding from the school choice revolving?
Oh, with it.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, with it.
How does the board wish to proceed?
Does anybody want to discuss? If you'd like to go up there.
I'm getting cramped just sitting there. I think somebody's got to present another opinion on this thing. I did a 10-year stint on the school committee back before Heather was born.
For this school here?
Actually, this school was active when I did. That was back when we had one principal for two schools instead of two principals for one, I might add. Bottom line here is, all due respect to John, I fully understand where he's coming from on this thing, but voc ed is a crapshoot. Just to put things into perspective, the increase in that crapshoot, frankly, is enough to fund a second shift in the fire department, which we're all struggling with frantically. Most departments do not have an opportunity to put money in the bank, which is basically what the voc ed business is all about. We did it back when I was on the school committee. You always want to make sure there's enough in there so that, you know, if you need a slush fund, that's where you're going to get it. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have a slush fund, but call it what it is. If you're going to do this like every other department does, and I'm not saying that you should, if you do it like every other department does, and you end up short on voc ed, Smith School, whatever, you got two in Westfield apparently, that's when you go back to town meeting for the extra funding instead of having it in the slush fund to begin with. The rest of us don't have that. I'm just bringing this to bear.
Again, memory, but don't we normally go back and transfer money to Norris mid-year? Right, not, yeah. Okay, which is what you're suggesting, I believe. Wait until you need it and have it transferred. at
When
town
you
meeting.
need it, obviously, we're committed. I mean, we've got to send these kids to voc ed,
Sure.
the ones that want it, no question.
Yep,
The only question is whether you bank the money right now,
yep.
or if and when you need it, that's when you ask for it. Because we always have that supplementary meeting.
Okay, thanks. Charlie?
It just popped into my head, but if it's a slush fund, then we should get 10 more kids to apply. Right? So there's just that thought. And I mean, it wasn't that long, I was on finance, when we looked at vocational as, yep, we're going to budget that at 100.
Yeah.
It was kind of like when, with the auto excise tax, it was lucky bucks, right? But it's not that when you're towing the line on net school spending and you're looking at, okay, here's what we need to spend on education, which lines do we put it in? That's this discussion now. I agree there should be some conservatism on making sure that you're able to, that you're not swinging the pendulum the wrong way on the vocational ed, but I do believe that we need to take the approach that says, hey, here's what history says, and let's do that. I mean, unless you're ready to vote on moving money up, maybe you do take it offline and Monday to the folks that look at those kinds of things. We get the numbers to them that we look at and that we looked at before we went to annual town meeting last year and asked for the transfer.
Mike?
One clarification, because we were doing some math and the number, so the 1.019, how many students is that based off of?
52 point.
Plus the two kids from Westfield.
And that's at the value of,
17,000 each, plus special education costs, which vary based on the needs.
Special education is $4,190 per student. We have 21.5 students potentially with special ed for next year. That includes special ed as well? Yes. Because you
And
do
then
the straight math, it's 60 kids.
Yeah.
So, for those at home who aren't hearing the discussion in the audience, it's going back and forth between Francine and Vicky, the accountant. They're just talking about the numbers. 52.5 kids have currently signed up to go to Smith Vocational. Approximately 21 of them have a special education piece that ranges, but somewhere around $4,000 per child. And then there's also the two kids who are going to Westfield Vocational School in that mix.
What I don't know, and we might want to understand for this conversation, is what these numbers, what part of the state's decision on the Smith waiver is in these numbers.
It is the $17,000.
So the 500 per student is out of this number?
Yes.
Thank you.
That's why the elementary budget changed since the last time, when you go forward here. I go too far? No, okay. So that's why you see over here, the net school spending number was originally 3.7 for the elementary school, and down here was 1,047,000 and changed to 1,019,000. That's where the change went of those funds. How does the board wish to proceed on this? Do we want to leave vocational tuition where it is? Does the board wish to move it based on number of allocated students that they guess aren't going to be there? Do you wish to see if we can get a hold of that chart before Tuesday so folks can review and then make an educated response on Tuesday when we're doing the final budget approval with the warrant?
That would be my preference.
Mine too.
Everyone's good with that?
Yeah.
John, if you can find a way to get those stats to us?
I'm getting it to, is it a finance meeting on Monday or a finance?
Finance committee's meeting on Monday as well, but if we get it to us before then, I can disseminate it to the world.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, elementary school notes, we already went through all of this stuff here. Transportation, so then we're back to the transportation piece, and what do? Do we fund it at the 248, which means we need to increase expenses by $10,000? Do we unfund it by another $10,000 and put it at 227 to reflect the current status of the busing situation? Does the board wish to make a decision on this piece now, or does the board wish to wait till Tuesday on this piece? John now has additional comments on transportation that he wasn't thinking were coming, so, excuse me.
I'd recommend you wait till Tuesday. There was a school committee meeting tonight. I don't have the benefit of the discussion there. I'm not aware of the discussion about overcrowding and wanting to keep a bus, so that would have been introduced tonight. We can bring that to whatever it needs to be on Monday.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, is everyone happy with that answer? Excellent. Public Works, we move on. All right.
Hey, Heather,
Yes, you want to take a break, or you want to discontinue?
3-minute break.
Taking a break.